There it is. All right. So it's time to start our reading now. One last chance to scan into the group if you need the story recordings, and then we can jump in. Here is a picture of the original cover of the book. Now, a lot of you may have been interested in this story of Mary Poppins because you may have seen the movie. That movie was made by Disney, where they have lots of nice singing and wonderful magical things happen with Mary Poppins. Well, that movie was created after this book was written. So this lady named Pamela Lyndon Travers, she wrote the book. And her book is not the same as the movie. The movie is different. The movie changed her story. And actually, when the lady who wrote the book, when she saw the movie for the first time, she was very sad because she thought, they changed my story so much. That's not what I wrote. They changed the details. And so as I read this book to you, I'm going to focus on sharing what is in the book. And I'll try not to show you too many pictures of the movie because the movie was not always showing us what she actually wrote, if you know what I mean. Okay, so Mary Poppins, P.L. Travers, Pamela Lyndon Travers. Here we go. Chapter 1, East Wind. If you want to find Cherry Tree Lane, all you have to do is ask the policeman at the crossroads. Now, one more thing I forgot to tell you, friends, is that this book was written many years ago, just like Stuart Little. And so you're going to see some things that are old-fashioned. And this was even written in England. And so there may be even some words that you think, that sounds strange to me. P.L. Travers, she was from Australia. Her family was from Australia, and then they moved to England. So she spent a long time in England. She lived there. So her story takes place in England. And like I said, it was many years ago. So you're going to see some things that are old-fashioned. The policeman will push his helmet slightly to one side, scratch his head thoughtfully, and then he will point his huge white gloved finger and say, first to your right, second to your left, sharp right again, and you're there. Good morning. And sure enough, if you follow his directions exactly, you will be there, right in the middle of Cherry Tree Lane, where the houses run down one side and the park runs down the other, and the cherry trees go dancing right down the middle. If you are looking for number 17, it is more than likely that you will be for this book. And it is more likely that you will be for this book. It's all about that particular house. You will very soon find it. To begin with, it is the smallest house in the lane. Besides that, it is the only one that is rather dilapidated and needs a coat of paint. But Mr. Banks, who owns it, said to Mrs. Banks that she could either have a nice, clean, comfortable house or 4 children, but not both, for he could not afford it. So if you don't have a very fancy house, it might be because you don't have enough money. And the Banks family has 4 kids. Kids cost a lot of money. I bet you know that. And so the dad, Mr. Banks, said, if we want to have a nice house, we can only have maybe 2 kids. But if we want to have 4 kids, then we need to have an okay house. And their house is kind of okay. Number 17, you see there's an arrow here on the picture. It needs a coat of paint, which means the paint on the outside is kind of looking old. After Mrs. Banks had given the matter some consideration, she came to the conclusion that she would rather have Jane, who was the eldest, and Michael, who came next, and John and Barbara, who were twins and came last of all. So it was settled, and that was how the Banks family came to live at number 17, with Mrs. Brill to cook for them, and Ellen to lay the tables, and Robertson A. to cut the lawn and clean the knives and polish the shoes, and Mr. Banks always said to waste his time and money. And of course, besides these, there was Katie Nana, who doesn't really deserve to come into the book at all because at the time I am speaking of, she had just left number 17. Without by your leave or a word of warning, and what am I to do? Said Mrs. Banks. Advertise, my dear, said Mr. Banks, putting on his shoes. And I wish Robertson A. would go without a word of warning, for he has again polished one boot and left the other untouched. I shall look very lopsided. That, said Mrs. Banks, is not of the least importance. You haven't told me what I am to do about Katie Nana. I don't see how you can do anything about her since she has disappeared, replied Mr. Banks. But if it were me, I should get somebody to put in the morning paper the news that Jane and Michael and John and Barbara Banks, to say nothing of their mother, require the best possible nanny at the lowest possible wage and at once. Then I should wait and watch for the nannies to queue up outside the front gate, and I should get very cross with them for holding up the traffic and making it necessary for me to call the policeman, to give the policeman a shilling for putting him to so much trouble. Now I must be off. Whew, it's as cold as the North Pole. Which way is the wind blowing? And as he said that, Mr. Banks popped his head out of the window and looked down the lane to Admiral Boone's house at the corner. Now, if you look here in the picture, friends, this white house with that flag on the top, that's the one. That's Admiral Boone's house. This was the grandest house in the lane, and the lane was very proud of it because it was built exactly like a ship. There was a flagstaff in the garden, and on the roof was a gilt weathercock shaped like a telescope. Ha! Said Mr. Banks, drawing his head very quickly. Admiral's telescope says east wind. I thought as much. There is frost in my bones. I shall wear 2 overcoats. And he kissed his wife absent-mindedly on the side of her nose and waved to the children and went away to the city. Now, did you understand the problem that they're talking about? Katie Nana, who is the nanny for their family, she just left, suddenly left. Now, I have pictures here of nannies. A nanny, maybe in China we call it like ai. Ai is the one that is to 照顾孩子, take care of the kids, not just for cooking or for cleaning, the ai that takes care of the kids. And in this time in England, it was very common for families like this to have some ai to take care of the kids. And they have 4 kids, so that's kind of a lot, I'm sure. And they had a nanny named Katie Nana, but she just quit. She said goodbye. She decided she didn't want to work there anymore. I don't know why, but she just left. She disappeared. And so the mother is saying, oh, what can I do? I have no nanny to help me take care of my kids. And well, her husband said, put it in the newspaper. Put it in the Morning Post. Now, these are pictures of newspapers from the old times. Most people don't read the newspaper nowadays. At least I don't think they do. But there used to be, in many cities across the world, a newspaper that we printed for every morning and even every evening. So maybe more than one newspaper a day. And that newspaper was how everybody spread the news. And if they need help, they can ask for help in the newspaper. And so what you could do is pay a bit of money and then ask someone to help you, and then put your phone number. And if people want to help you, they can just give you a call or come to your house and say, oh, I'll be here to help you. Or I can, be your new nanny. Mr. Banks said, just put a part in the newspaper about this, that we need a nanny for our 4 kids, and see who will come and be our new nanny. Well, sounds simple, right? This is what he suggests to his wife. Now, here's a picture of Mr. Banks, and there's Jane and Michael. Jane's the oldest, then there's Michael, and then there's 2 twin babies named John and Barbara. And I don't know if you remember this, but in the movie, there was only 2 kids, but in the book, there's 4. And I think that's great. So Jane and Michael, and then John and Barbara Banks. Those are the kids, Mrs. Banks and Mr. Banks, and then Ellen is one of the maids. There's another female maid. I forget her name at the moment. And then there's the man who polishes the shoes and takes care of the work outside. So they have like 3 helpers that work at their house, and they want to find a nanny to help too. So this is the situation. And I bet you can guess that the woman in the picture that's not, I didn't put her name, that's Mary Poppins. And then I'm going to introduce to you the man who's like kneeling on the ground. I'm going to talk about him soon. Okay. Now, the city was a place where Mr. Banks went every day, except Sundays, of course, and bank holidays. And while he was there, he sat on a large chair in front of a large desk and made money. All day long he worked, cutting out pennies and shillings and half-crowns and 3-penny bits. He brought them home with him in his little black bag. Sometimes he would give some to Jane and Michael for their money boxes. And when he couldn't spare any, he would say, "The bank is broken," and they would know he hadn't made much money that day. Well, Mr. Banks went off with his black bag, and Mrs. Banks went into the drawing room and sat there all day long, writing letters to the papers and begging them to send some nannies to her house at once. As she was waiting, and upstairs in the nursery, Jane and Michael watched at the window and wondered who would come. They were glad Katie Nana had gone, for they never liked her. She was old and fat and smelt of barley water. Anything, they thought, would be better than Katie Nana, if not much better. When the afternoon began to die away behind the park, Mrs. Brill, oh, that's the name of the kitchen maid who does the cooking, Mrs. Brill and Ellen came to give them their supper and to bathe the twins. And after supper, Jane and Michael sat at the window watching for Mr. Banks to come home and listening to the sound of the east wind blowing through the naked branches of the cherry trees in the lane. The trees themselves, turning and bending in the half light, looked as though they had gone mad and were dancing their roots out of the ground. So that means it was very windy. "There he is," said Michael, pointing suddenly to a shape that banged heavily against the gate. Jane peered through the gathering darkness. "That's not Daddy," she said. "It's somebody else." Then the shape tossed and bent under the wind, lifted the latch of the gate, and they could see that it belonged to a woman who was holding her hat with one hand and carrying a bag in the other. You see just in the picture here. As they watched, Jane and Michael saw a curious thing happen. As soon as the shape was inside the gate, the wind seemed to catch her up into the air and fling her at the house. It was as though it had flung her first at the gate, waiting for her to open it, and then it had lifted her and thrown her, bag and all, at the front door. The watching children heard a terrific bang. As she landed, the whole house shook. "How funny! I've never seen that before. That happened before," said Michael. "Let's go and see who it is," said Jane. And taking Michael's arm, she drew him away from the window, through the nursery and out onto the landing. From there, they always had such a good view of anything that happened in the front hall. Presently, they saw their mother coming out of the drawing room, with a visitor following her. Jane and Michael could see that the newcomer had shiny black hair. "Rather like a wooden Dutch doll," whispered Jane, "and that she was thin, with large feet and hands, and small, rather peering blue eyes." So Jane says this woman looks like a wooden Dutch doll. Let me show you let me show you these pictures first. We can get a better view of the house and the front gate, and then Mary Poppins as she is blown in the wind to come to the house. And then this is a wooden Dutch doll. And just like the book describes Miss Mary Poppins as being thin, This doll is very thin, isn't it? And it has that dark black hair. That's a wooden Dutch doll. And I think it does kind of look like the picture that was in the book. Jane says she looks like a wooden Dutch doll. You'll find that they are very nice children, Mrs. Banks was saying. Michael's elbow gave a sharp dig at Jane's ribs. And that they give no trouble at all, continued Mrs. Banks uncertainly, as if she herself didn't really believe what she was saying. They heard the visitor sniff as though she didn't either. Now, Mary Poppins does something that whenever she's bothered, she goes like this. That means she's kind of upset. So they heard the visitor sniff as though she didn't either, means like this. Now, about references, Mrs. Banks went on. Now, I don't know if you know this, friends, but references means when you want to get a new job, what you need to do is bring some sort of letter or a note. And that note is actually from your old boss. And if you had 3 bosses before, you worked at 3 jobs before you came to this new job that you want, you need to give a letter. And the letter says, hello, I am the person that was this lady or this man's boss before, and they're a very hard worker and they're honest and they'll do a good job. That's sort of a way to prove that you will be a good worker and you will be a good choice. And that's what Miss Banks is asking for, references, like letters from the people that Mary Poppins has worked for before, you know? Oh, I make it a rule never to give references, said the other firmly. So Mary Poppins is saying, no, I don't have any. Mrs. Banks stared. But I thought it was usual, she said. I mean, I understood people always did. A very old-fashioned idea to my mind. Jane and Michael heard the stern voice say, very old-fashioned, quite out of date, as you might say. Now, if there was one thing Mrs. Banks did not like, it was to be thought old-fashioned. She just couldn't bear it. So she said quickly, very well then, we won't bother about them. I only asked, of course, in case you required it. The nursery is upstairs. And she led the way towards the staircase, talking all the time, without stopping once. And because she was doing that, Mrs. Banks did not notice what was happening behind her. But Jane and Michael, watching from the top landing, had an excellent view of the extraordinary thing the visitor now did. Certainly she followed Mrs. Banks upstairs, but not in the usual way. With her large bag in her hands, she slid gracefully up the banisters. Now, do you see this picture here of the stairwell? We could call it a staircase, a stairwell, but this part, we could call it like the railing, the rail of the staircase. We could also call that the banister. And if you stand at the top and you get on it, you sit yourself down here, you could slide all the way down. Except the visitor, who's Mary Poppins, she didn't slide down, she slid up. She sat down at the bottom and slid all the way up. It doesn't make any sense. And the mother wasn't paying attention, but the kids were. And they're like, how did she just do that? Such a thing, Michael and Jane knew, had never been done before. Down, of course, for they had often done it themselves, but up, never. They gazed curiously at the strange new visitor. Well, that's all settled then. A sigh of relief came from the children's mother. Quite, as long as I am satisfied, said the other, wiping her nose with a large red and white bandana handkerchief. Now, do you see that picture here in the corner? That red cloth, you could fold it up, keep it in your pocket as a handkerchief. And I remember I told you before that handkerchief was used like a tissue, or you just keep it on you, like judging, just in case you need something to wipe something away, sweat or snot or anything. So Do you realize what just happened? This woman walked in their house, and the mother didn't even ask her questions, hardly, didn't even take her references. And Mary Poppins says, yes, this will do. I'm fine. I'll work here. Hmm. Why, children, said Mrs. Banks, noticing them suddenly, what are you doing there? This is your new nurse, Mary Poppins. Jane, Michael, say how do you do? And these, she waved her hand at the babies in their cots, these are the twins. Mary Poppins regarded them steadily, looking from one to the other as though she were making up her mind whether she liked them or not. Will we do? Said Michael. Michael, don't be naughty, said his mother. Mary Poppins continued to regard the four children searchingly. Then, with a long, loud sniff that seemed to indicate she had made up her mind, she said, I'll take the position. For all the world, as Miss Banks said to her husband later, as though we were doing us a signal honor, as though she were doing us a signal honor. Which means, so this is now later, Mrs. Banks is telling her husband, you'll never believe what this nanny did. She said, oh, I'll take the position. Like, you should be thankful for me. Not, oh, thank you so much for this new job. It's, I'll take the position. You're welcome kind of attitude. Perhaps she is, said Mr. Banks, putting his nose round the corner of the newspaper for a moment, and then withdrawing it very quickly. When their mother had gone, Jane and Michael edged toward Mary Poppins, who stood, still as a post, with her hands folded in front of her. How did you come? Jane asked. It looked just as if the wind blew you here. I did, said Mary Poppins briefly, and she proceeded to unwind her muffler from around her neck and take off her hat, which she hung on one of the bedposts. As it did not seem as though Mary Poppins were going to say any more, though she sniffed a great deal, Jane too remained silent. But when she bent down to undo her bag, Michael could not restrain himself. What's a funny bag? He said, pinching it with his fingers. Carpet, said Mary Poppins, putting her key in the lock. To carry carpets in, you mean? No, made of. Oh, said Michael, I see. But he didn't quite. So the bag she's carrying is called a carpet bag. I'm going to show you a picture of it. Oh, there it is. Next to above the stairwell picture, you can tell that it's thick. It's made of a thick fabric that it's actually made of a carpet. Carpets are what we put on our floors. So I guess if one gets old, you can just cut it up and sew it into a bag. By this time, the bag was open, and Jane and Michael were more than surprised to find it was completely empty. Why, said Jane, there's nothing in it. What do you mean, nothing? Demanded Mary Poppins, drawing herself up and looking as though she'd been insulted. Nothing in it, did you say? And with that, she took out from an empty bag a starched white apron and tied it round her waist. Now, do you see this picture here of the girl in the dress with the white apron on? That was the kind of clothes that women who were working as ayis in houses like this would wear, an apron, a white apron. She pulled that out of her bag. Now, when Jane had looked in it, it was empty. And now she pulled an apron out of it. Next, Mary Poppins unpacked a large cake of Sunlight soap, a toothbrush, a packet of hairpins, a bottle of scent is perfume, a small folding armchair, and a box of throat lozenges. Okay, so she has one bag that is a carpet bag. She takes the apron, the soap, the toothbrush, the hairpins, the chair, the scent, and the throat lozenges out of this bag. Now, how is anybody going to fit a chair in their bag? The kids are so confused. Jane and Michael stared. "But I saw," whispered Michael. "It was empty." "Hush," said Jane, as Mary Poppins took out a large bottle labeled 1 teaspoon to be taken at bedtime. A spoon was attached to the neck of the bottle, and into this Mary Poppins poured a dark crimson fluid. Crimson is red, so you see there the bottle pouring into the crimson liquid into the spoon. "Is that your medicine?" inquired Michael, looking very interested. "No, yours," said Mary Poppins, holding out the spoon to him. Michael stared. He wrinkled up his nose. He began to protest. "I don't want it! I don't need it! I won't!" But Mary Poppins' eyes were fixed on him, and Michael suddenly discovered that you could not look at Mary Poppins and disobey her. There was something strange and extraordinary about her, something that was frightening and at the same time most exciting. The spoon came nearer. He held his breath, shut his eyes, and gulped. A delicious taste ran into his mouth. He turned his tongue in it. He swallowed, and a happy smile ran round his face. "Strawberry ice," he said ecstatically. "More, more, more." But Mary Poppins, her face as stern as before, was pouring out a dose for Jane. It ran into the spoon. Silvery, greeny, yellowy. Okay, now this is the same bottle. Pour it into the first spoon, it turns out to be red. Pour it into the second spoon, it's silvery, greeny, and yellowy. Jane tasted it. "Lime juice cordial," she said, sliding her tongue deliciously over her lips. But when she saw Mary Poppins moving towards the twins with the bottle, Jane rushed at her. "Oh no, please, they're too young. It wouldn't be good for them, please." Mary Poppins, however, took no notice, but with a warning, terrible glance at Jane, tipped the spoon towards John's mouth. He lapped at it eagerly, and by the few drops that were spilt on his bib, Jane and Michael could tell that the substance in the spoon was milk. So the same bottle can pour red juice, yellow juice, or liquid, and milk. Then Barbara had her share, and she gurgled and licked the spoon twice. Mary Poppins then poured another dose and solemnly took it herself. Rum punch. You see the orange one? Rum punch would be an orange color. Rum punch, she said, smacking her lips and corking the bottle. Jane's eyes and Michael's eyes popped with astonishment. But they were not given much time to wonder, for Mary Poppins, having put the miraculous bottle on the mantelpiece, turned to them. "Now," she said, "Spit-Spot into bed." And she began to undress them. They noticed that whereas the buttons and hooks had needed all sorts of coaxing from Katie Nana, for Mary Poppins they flew apart almost at a look. In less than a minute they found themselves in bed and watching, by the dim light from the nightlight, the rest of Mary Poppins' unpacking being performed. From the carpet bag, she took out 7 flannel nightgowns, 4 cotton ones, a pair of boots, a set of dominoes, 2 bathing caps, and a postcard album. Let me show you these things here. Here are her flannel nightgowns, her cotton nightgowns, which basically is just pajamas, boots, dominoes, swimming caps, which girls used to always like to cover their hair when they swam or got their hair wet, or not get their hair wet. So she had 2 of those, and she had a postcard album of pictures of, it's postcards that you can get when you go to different places and just keep them in a little book. Last of all came a folding camp bedstead with blankets and an eiderdown complete. And then she sat down between John's cot and Barbara's. Okay, so out of her bag, she pulls all this plus all this, including the bed. This is a certain kind of bed you can fold up. You see? This is a certain kind of like bed you can take with you to places. And she even had covers on it, thick blankets and this down, eiderdown, thick, comfortable blanket. She had all of that in her bag. And the kids are just amazed. Jane and Michael sat hugging themselves and watching. It was all so surprising that they could find nothing to say, but they knew, both of them, that something strange and wonderful had happened at number 17, Cherry Tree Lane. Mary Poppins, slipping on one of the flannel nightgowns over her head, began to undress underneath it as though it were a tent. Michael, charmed by the strange new arrival, unable to keep silent any longer, called to her. "Mary Poppins," he cried, "you'll never leave us, will you?" There was no reply from under the nightgown. Michael could not bear it. "You won't leave us, will you?" he called anxiously. Mary Poppins' head came out from the top of the nightgown. She looked very fierce. "One more word from that direction," she said threateningly, "and I'll call the police." "I was only saying," began Michael meekly, "that we hoped you wouldn't be going away soon." He stopped, feeling very red and confused. Mary Poppins stared from him to Jane in silence. "I'll stay till the wind changes," she said shortly, and she blew out her candle and got into bed. "That's all right," said Michael, half to himself and half to Jane. But Jane wasn't listening. She was thinking about all that had happened and wondering. And that is how Mary Poppins came to live at number 17, Cherry Tree Lane. And although they sometimes found themselves wishing for the quieter, more ordinary days when Katie Nana ruled the household, everybody on the whole was glad of Mary Poppins' arrival. Mr. Banks was glad because, as she arrived by herself and did not hold up the traffic, he had not had to tip the policeman. Mrs. Banks was glad because she was able to tell everybody that her children's nurse was so fashionable that she didn't believe in giving references. Mrs. Brill and Ellen were glad because they could drink strong cups of tea all day in the kitchen and no longer need to preside at the nursery suppers. Robertson was glad too because Mary Poppins only had one pair of shoes, and those she polished herself. But nobody ever knew what Mary Poppins felt about it. Mary Poppins never told anybody anything. Here we have a picture of all the kids at the bottom. I see Jane is holding baby Barbara and Michael is holding baby John. Chapter 2. The day out. "Every third Thursday," said Mrs. Banks, two till 5. Mary Poppins eyed her sternly. "The best people, ma'am," she said, "give every second Thursday, and 1 till 6. And those I shall take, or—" Mary Poppins paused. Mrs. Banks knew what the pause meant. It meant that if she didn't get what she wanted, Mary Poppins would not stay. So Mary Poppins is asking for a day to rest, a day to have off, a day to let her go out and be on her own and not be with the kids. And her boss, Mrs. Banks, wants to give her a break every 3 weeks. And she said, "No, I want a break every 2 weeks." and Mrs. Banks wants to give her 3 hours to herself. And she said, no, I want 5 hours to myself. And if you don't give it to me, I'm quitting. Very well, said Mrs. Banks hurriedly, though she wished Mary Poppins did not know so very much more about the best people than she did herself. So Mary Poppins put on her white gloves and tucked her umbrella under her arm, not because it was raining, but because it had such a beautiful handle that she couldn't possibly leave it at home. How could you leave your umbrella behind if it had a parrot's head for a handle? Besides, Mary Poppins was very vain and liked to look her best. Indeed, she was quite sure that she never looked anything else. Jane waved to her from the nursery window. Where are you going? She called. Kindly close that window, replied Mary Poppins, and Jane's head hurriedly disappeared inside the nursery. Mary Poppins walked down the garden path and opened the gate. Once outside in the lane, she set off walking very quickly, as if she were afraid that the afternoon would run away from her if she didn't keep up with it. At the corner, she turned to the right and then to the left, nodding haughtily to the policeman, who said it was a nice day, and by that time she felt that her day out had begun. She stopped beside an empty motor car in order to put her hat straight with the help of the windscreen in which it was reflected. And then she smoothed down her frock and tucked her umbrella securely under her arm so that the handle, or rather the parrot, could be seen by everybody. After these preparations, she went forward to meet the Matchman man. Now, the Matchman had two professions. He not only sold matches, and now you see this picture here, friends, of the matches. Matches can make a little fire. They can, if you want to have a little fire to light a candle, or some people use them to light a cigarette. You might see people doing that. But it just is helpful to have a pair of matches when you need it. He not only sold matches like an ordinary matchman, but he also drew pavement pictures as well. He did these things turnabout according to the weather. If it was wet, he sold matches because the rain would have washed his pictures away if he had painted them. If it was fine, he was on his knees all day making pictures in colored chalks on the sidewalks and doing them so quickly that often you would find he had painted one up on the side of the street and down the other almost before you had come round the corner. Here he is. Here's the Matchman. On this particular day, which was fine but cold, he was in the act of adding a picture of 2 bananas, an apple, and a head of Queen Elizabeth to a long string of others when Mary Poppins walked up to him, tiptoeing so as to surprise him. Hey, called Mary Poppins softly, and he went on putting brown stripes on a banana and brown curls on Queen Elizabeth's head. Ahem, said Mary Poppins with a ladylike cough. He turned and saw her. Mary, he cried, and you could tell by the way he cried that Mary Poppins was an important person in his life. Mary Poppins looked down at her feet and rubbed the toe of one shoe along the pavement 2 or 3 times. Then she smiled at the shoe in such a way that the shoe knew quite well that the smile wasn't meant for it. It's my day, Bert, she said. Didn't you remember? Bert was the matchman's name. Herbert Alfred for Sundays. So Bert is just his nickname. His real name is Herbert. Of course I remembered, Mary, he said, but, and he stopped and looked sadly into his cap. It lay on the ground beside his last picture, and there was 2pence in it. He picked it up and jingled the pennies. Now you see here, friends, this picture of this hat on the ground with the money in it. I'm sure you've seen that before. When people want money, they put their hat on the street, and you can put money in it for them if you want to. You don't have to. And when people like this do something nice for other people to enjoy, maybe they play music or they do a dance or they do some art on the street, then they will hope that other people will enjoy it so much that they'll give money. But all Bert has is tuppence, which means 2 pennies. So, and even though the picture I put has a lot of money, actually he only has 2 pennies. And he's sad because that's not very much at all. "That's all you got, Bert?" said Mary Poppins, and she said it so brightly you could hardly tell she was disappointed at all. "That's the lot," he said. "Business is bad today. You'd think anybody'd be glad to pay to see that, wouldn't you?" And he nodded his head at Queen Elizabeth. "Well, that's how it is, Mary," he said. "Can't take you to tea today, I'm afraid." Mary Poppins thought of the raspberry jam cakes they always had on her day out, and she was just going to sigh when she saw the matchman's face. So very cleverly she turned the sigh into a smile. A good one, with both ends turned up, and said, "It's all right, Bert. Don't you mind. I'd much rather not go to tea. A stodgy meal, I call it, really." And that, when you think how very much she liked raspberry jam cakes, was a rather nice of Mary Poppins. The matchman apparently thought so too, for he took her white gloved hand in his and squeezed it hard. Then together they walked down the row of pictures. "Now there's one you've never seen before." "Oh, now there's one you've never seen before," said the matchman proudly, pointing to a painting of a mountain covered with snow and its slopes simply littered with grasshoppers sitting on gigantic roses. This time Mary Poppins could indulge in a sigh without hurting his feelings. "Oh, Bert," she said, "that's a fair treat." And by the way she said it, she made him feel the rights, but that by rights the picture should have been in the Royal Academy, which is a large room where people hang the pictures that they've painted. Everybody comes to see them, and when they have looked at them for a very long time, everybody says to everybody else, "The idea, my dear." The next picture Mary Poppins and the matchman came to was even better. It was the country. All the trees and grass and a little bit of blue sea in the distance, and something that looked like Margate in the background. "My word," said Mary Poppins admiringly, stooping so she could see it better. "Why, Bert, whatever is the matter?" For the matchman had caught hold of her hand now and was looking very excited. "Mary," he said, "I got an idea, a real idea. Why don't we go there right now, this very day, both together, into the picture? Eh, Mary?" And still holding her hands, he drew her right out of the street, away from the iron railings and the lampposts, and into the very middle of the picture. Poof! There they were, right inside it. How green it was and how quiet, and what soft, crisp grass under their feet. They could hardly believe it was true. And yet here were green branches, huskily rattling on their hats as they bent beneath them, and little colored flowers curling around their shoes. They stared at each other and they bent beneath. And they each noticed that the other had changed. To Mary Poppins, the matchman seemed to have bought himself an entirely new set of clothes, for he was now wearing a bright green and red striped coat and white flannel trousers, and best of all, a new straw hat. He looked unusually clean, as though he had been polished. "Why, Bert, you look fine. she cried in an admiring voice. Bert could not say anything for a moment, for his mouth had fallen open and he was staring at her with round eyes. Then he gulped and said, "Golly!" That was all. But he said it in such a way and stared so steadily and so delightedly at her that she took a little mirror out of her bag and looked at herself in it. She, too, discovered, had changed. Round her shoulders hung a cloak of lovely artificial silk with watery patterns all over it, and the tickling feeling at the back of her neck came, the mirror told her, from a long curly feather that swept down from the brim of her hat. Her best shoes had disappeared, and in their place were others much finer with large diamond buckles shining upon them. She was still wearing the white gloves and carrying the umbrella. "My goodness," said Mary Poppins, "I am having a day out." So, still admiring themselves and each other, they moved on together through the little wood, till presently they came upon a little open space filled with sunlight, and there, on a green table, was afternoon tea. A pile of raspberry jam cakes as high as Mary Poppins' waist stood in the center, and beside it, tea was boiling in a big brass urn. Best of all, there were 2 plates of whelks and 2 pins to pick them out with. "Strike me pink," said Mary Poppins. That was what she always said when she was pleased. "Golly," said the Matchman, and that was his particular phrase. "Won't you sit down, madam?" inquired a voice, and as they turned to find a tall man in a black coat coming out of the wood with a table napkin over his arm. Mary Poppins, though surprised, sat down with a plop upon one of the little green chairs that stood round the table. The Matchman, staring, collapsed onto the other. "I'm the waiter, you know," explained the man in the black coat. "Oh, but I didn't see you in the picture," said Mary Poppins. Here they are. There's the waiter. There's Bert in his new striped jacket with his straw hat and his flannel trousers, and Mary Poppins with that big feather in her hat and her fancy shoes with the diamond buckles. Wow. "Ah, I was behind the tree," said the waiter. "Won't you sit down?" said Mary Poppins politely. "Waiters never sit down, madam," said the man, but he seemed pleased at being asked. "Your whelks, mister." Oh, wait, sorry. Oh, he's giving it to Bert. "Your whelks, mister," he said, pushing a plate of them over to the Matchman. "And your pin?" He dusted the pin on his napkin and handed it to the Matchman. They began upon the afternoon tea, and the waiter stood beside them to see if they had everything they needed. "Having them after all," said Mary Poppins in a loud whisper, and as she began on the heap of raspberry jam cakes. "Golly," said the Matchman, helping himself to 2 of the largest. "Tea," said the waiter, filling a large cup for each of them from the urn. They drank it and had 2 cups more of each, and then, for luck, they finished the pile of raspberry jam cakes. After that, they got up and brushed the crumbs off. "There is nothing to pay," said the waiter, before they had time to ask for the bill. "It is a pleasure. You will find the merry-go-round just over there." And he waved his hand to the little gap in the trees, where Mary Poppins and the Matchman could see several wooden horses swirling around on a stand. "That's funny," she said. "I don't remember seeing that in the picture either." "Oh," said the "Oh, oh," said the Matchman, who hadn't remembered it himself. "It was in the background, you see." The merry-go-round was just slowing down as they approached it. They leapt upon it, Mary Poppins on a black horse, and the Matchman on a gray. And when the music started again, they began to move, and they rode all the way to Yarmouth and back, because that was the place they both wanted most to see. When they returned, it was nearly dark, and the waiter was searching for them. "I'm very sorry, madam and mister," he said politely, "but we close at 7. Rules, you know. May I show you the way out?" They nodded as he flourished his table napkin and walked them out in front through the wood. It's a wonderful picture you've drawn this time, Bert," said Mary Poppins, putting her hand through the Matchman's arm and drawing her cloak about her. "Well, I did my best, Mary," said the Matchman modestly, but you could see he was really very pleased with himself indeed. Just then the waiter stopped in front of them, beside a large white doorway that looked as though it were made of thick chalk lines. "Here you are," he said, "this way out." "Goodbye, and thank you," said Mary Poppins, shaking his hand. "Madam, goodbye," said the waiter, bowing so low that his head knocked against his knees. He nodded to the Matchman, who cocked his head to the side and closed one eye at the waiter, which was his way of bidding him farewell. Then Mary Poppins stepped through the white doorway, and the Matchman followed her. And as they went, the feather dropped from her hat, and the silk cloak from her shoulders, and the diamonds from her shoes. The bright clothes of the Matchman faded, and his straw hat turned into his old ragged cap again. Mary Poppins turned and looked at him, and she knew at once what had happened. Standing on the pavement, she gazed at him for a long minute, and then her glance explored the wood behind him for the waiter, but the waiter was nowhere to be seen. There was nobody in the picture. Nothing moved there. Even the merry-go-round had disappeared. Only the trees and the grass and the little unmoving patch of sea remained. But Mary Poppins and the Matchman smiled at one another. They knew, you see, what lay behind the trees. When she came back from her day out, Jane and Michael came running to meet her. "Where have you been?" they asked her. "In Fairyland," said Mary Poppins. "Did you see Cinderella?" said Jane. "Huh? Cinderella, not me," said Mary Poppins contemptuously. "Cinderella, indeed." "Or Robinson Crusoe?" asked Michael. "Robinson Crusoe, pooh," said Mary Poppins rudely. "Then how could you have been there? It couldn't have been our fairyland." Mary Poppins gave a superior sniff. "Don't you know," she said pityingly, "that everybody's got a fairyland of their own?" And with another sniff, she went upstairs to take off her white gloves and put the umbrella away. And friends, that is where we will stop tonight. Wow, it's exactly 8:30. Thank you for joining me for chapters 1 and 2. I hope you have a great night, guys. Good night. See you later. Bye-bye.